All right. And in the exact similar sorts of vein, I would like to talk about a guy named Chris Hedges. So, Chris Hedges is a left wing reporter, a far left reporter, and he's been one of the major people who has been pushing Aaron Bushnell. And interesting left comes from everything with this weird pseudo religious viewpoint as well, which makes it fascinating because he is the sort of person who is exactly what I'm talking about, this exact sort of harmful, parasitic religious viewpoint. And the article that we're covering is Aaron Bushnell's Divine Violence, and this is from Chris Hedges' Substack. So this is what he starts it off with. Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation was ultimately a religious act, one that radically delineates good and evil and calls us to resist. So you'll note that he's going to go and call this a sacrifice. He's going to go and start being very, very religious about, which, as I point out, these types that call themselves secularists, in this case, like this whole far left absolutist mindset, these people are religious. They have a religious psychology. It's just been reframed to go and repackage things for a modern era. It's just like back when, Christianity and Islam were whirling around, and then they decide, oh, well, we're just going to go and abstract things a little bit more. So, we're no longer going to go and offer up animal sacrifices and that sort of thing. We're just going to go and have religion be a lot more abstract than it was previously in these areas. They haven't dropped all of the actual psychology, the actual human psychology of religion. Instead, what they've done is said, oh, we're just not going to go and have God generally. We're just not going to go and focus on God. We're going to go and focus on religion as social obligations, obligations to order the world socially in this exact sort of way. And then they'll bring along with that all of the other stuff associated with religion, like the guilt-tripping psychology, the absolutist mindset that you're for us or against us, and this mindset of the believer and the heretic and the believer and the faithless. These are all things that they believe in and teach. So once more, we have the introduction here. Aaron Bushnell, when he placed his cell phone on the ground to set up a live stream and lit himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., resulting in his death, pitted divine violence against radical evil. As an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, he was part of the vast machinery that sustains the ongoing genocide in Gaza, no less morally culpable than the German soldiers, technocrats, engineers, scientists, and bureaucrats who oiled the apparatus of the Nazi Holocaust. This was a role he could no longer accept. He died for our sins. Also, there's very, right off the bat, just, wow, the language that's being used. Okay, so for starters, the concept that you could cite the Holocaust, a conflict that began when a bunch of literal racist absolutists went into Israel and slaughtered random Jews just because they were Jewish and living in that exact area. And then all around the world, you have people who are attacking Jews for being Jews as a result of this. And then to that, you're going to go and compare that to the Nazi Holocaust? Yeah, so right off the bat, just absolute insanity, right? Absolute insanity. And then we note divine violence against radical evil. Divine violence against radical evil. This is absolutist language. Absolutist language. These are people who are absolutists. No matter how good you think their causes sound, I'm telling you, these are the sorts of people who have been culpable for the most evil things that have happened throughout history, unquestionably. Like, you think about the most evil empire, the most evil tribalistic empire that you have, it's absolutely nothing compared to what these sorts of people have accomplished throughout history. And they did it all under the banner of compassion as religion. So they said, oh, when we conquer this area and we go and kill all the pagans and then have everyone else who bends the knee go and convert, well, we're doing a good thing, right? We're doing a thing that is good. We're going and doing a thing which brings justice to the world over a mountain of dead bodies. This is what they're like, okay? And you're seeing here exactly the sort of mindset which leads to that radical absolutism, that anti-human idea. Divine violence against radical evil. And you're doing that to people simply because you hate them. This guy hates Israel. This is why he goes and delights in everything that happened to Israel, and meanwhile, or excuses it, which remember, this is another thing that absolutist ideologies do. The evils that they commit, that people associated with them commit, is minimized or denied. Meanwhile, all of the things that other people commit, that their opponents commit, are exaggerated or presented as being hyper evil. This is what they are. This is what they do. This is their propaganda line. It's always been their propaganda line. And it doesn't matter when you're talking about Christians that are going into an area and going and saying, oh, look at all these evil pagans who are going and sacrificing kids and blah, blah, blah. You know, stuff that almost never was actually true, but they went and used it as a propaganda line to go and present people as lesser than them. This is exactly what we're dealing with here. We are dealing with a faction that is non-absolutist. The Jewish people are not at the moment an absolutist faction. Remember, they don't have forcible conversions in their religion. They have a sort of ethnic focus. You can say that their religion is too tribalistic. That's fair enough. There was, of course, an alternative religion before there was the Israel-Judean split. We could get into that some other time, but just to say, though, that the Israeli psychology at the moment, the Jewish psychology at the moment, is not absolutist. Instead, you have these sorts of people who are going and saying, we're going to go and align ourselves with Hamas, which is an absolutist ideology. Hamas, in their ideology, wants everyone in the world to be forcibly converted to Islam. And that is why the people in the Middle East go and hyper support them. It's not because there's not other stuff that's happening in the Middle East that is unjust. Like, we've seen that for decades with places like Syria and Yemen. We've seen this for decades with stuff that's been happening there. And they just don't care. But they really care about Palestine because it is the Islamic people against the Jewish people. And that is it, because they're going to go and tribalistically align with the Islamic people. Whereas you'll note that the West, remember, the West, throughout its history, has 90% of the time hated Jews. Like, they were occasionally tolerated. They were, even then, the word ghetto, like, that literally comes from a Jewish area of the city, right? They were in their own little segregated little off areas where they had all these other different rules foisted upon them. Like, Europe and the West has hated Israel and the Jews for 90% of its history. And yet, we now have this Europe managing to go and bust out of that tribalistic, absolutist, us versus them mindset. And these people are going and criticizing us for it. And then look at this part here. He died for our sins. Like, boom. Like, that's just such... Well, that's insanity. So, of course, what he's comparing it to there is that whole religious scapegoat. Jesus died for our sins, and etc., etc. Of course, not what the real person would have done, but, you know, that's just what people go and read into that sort of thing. Alright, then we have this part. Young men and women sign up for the military for many reasons, but starving, bombing, and killing women and children is usually not amongst them. Shouldn't, in a just world, the U.S. fleet break the Israeli blockade of Gaza to provide food, shelter, and medicine? Shouldn't U.S. warplanes impose a no-fly zone over Gaza to halt the saturation bombing? Shouldn't Israel be issued an ultimatum to withdraw its forces from Gaza? Shouldn't the weapons shipments, billions of military aid and intelligence provided to Israel be halted? Shouldn't those who commit genocide, as well as those who support genocide, be held accountable? These are simple questions, are the ones Bushnell's death forces us to confront. So look at that. It's like, oh, in a perfect world, wouldn't we all just support Hamas instead, right? Wouldn't we all support Hamas? That's what he's saying, right? In our world, in reality land, Mr. Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winner. Gosh, how those standards must have dropped for you, get that. The real world is that Israel is our ally. They like us. Hamas is aligned with our enemies, with those people who hate us. And as a consequence, Hamas also hates us. So what you're saying is, why do we go and support the people who love us instead of the people who hate us? Is that really what you're saying? Is that what you're suggesting here? And then this concept of justice. Well, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, there isn't this weird, wild world out there where there's this idealistic notion of perfect justice in the world. Maybe, just maybe, you have to actually work out what justice means in the world. Which means that you have to sometimes make decisions to go and support your friends so that they can be the ones who help you out in that. Who help you discover what justice is. Not to have saying that justice is this thing that is already predetermined. So yeah, so why don't we attack our allies because we don't like this thing that they're doing? Well, for starters, our politicians, generally speaking, do align with Israel on these actions. What you're speaking for, Chris Hedges, is a very loud, vocal minority that wants to go and align with Hamas because you are the sorts of morons who always go and support whatever you label as the underdog without even going and looking into what that actually is, like what that actually entails. Because remember, there have been times at the foundation of Israel that pan-Arabic force that declared war on Israel. That was a more powerful group of countries that had a much larger population than Israel, and Israel defeated them by being smarter in the battlefield. So, and that doesn't mean that Israel is now suddenly the big player. No. Israel is next door to Egypt, for example. Egypt massively dwarfs Israel in terms of population. Like, it has 10 times the population of Israel. Easy. The states around, also oftentimes much larger. Like 2 or 3 times larger. So, Israel is not the big man in the region. They're a force that has operated smartly in the past, and the things, they have various tactical advantages that let a smaller population go and compete with larger ones. So Israel, in this situation, they're not this all-powerful monolithic empire. No. Israel is a country that was attacked by Hamas, and Hamas was well aware that they were operating in a smaller country that had a way worse military than the one that Israel has. They were just trying to go and get a whole bunch of other big countries involved by going and doing exactly what you're doing right now. Part of getting those bigger Middle Eastern countries involved, too, is that they want to go and isolate Israel. Because once Israel is isolated, well then a bunch of these other big countries can go and come in and attack Israel. That still is no guarantee of victory, by the way, because of course Israel has that tactical advantage of nuclear weapons. So essentially what Hamas is trying to do is go and provoke a war which will end with millions and millions of people in the Middle East dead, perhaps even tens of millions, because if you go and isolate Israel and then everyone goes and attacks Israel, this time around they're going to go and use that advantage of nuclear weapons on others. It just will be a matter of survival at that point. And people aren't suicidally inclined like this pseudo post-Christian morality is. Yeah, he died for our sins and this sort of nonsense. All right. We'll continue with what Chris is saying. Genocide is evil when it is carried out by our enemies. It is defended and sustained when carried out by our allies. Once more, this is not a genocide. Israel is attacking very explicitly the Hamas political organization. So until you can come and say that the consequences of this attack are intentionally genocidal, that is what they're going to result in, you need to not call it genocide. Because see, here's the thing. What would you have Israel do in this case? So they were attacked. Would you just have them, I don't know, go and seal off the border? Would that be justice? Like, how many countries would go and do that? So you're going to go and, oh, would, if Israel went into Palestine just out of the blue and then killed 1,500 people, like, what would this guy's response be to that? Well, of course he would go and condemn Israel, and then if Hamas went and did a counterattack in that case, well, he'd be fully on their side. He'd be like, oh, that's definitely justice. Well, he'll continue, and now he's going to get into talking about suicide as a political tool. Walter Benjamin, whose friends Fritz Heinel and Rika Seligson committed suicide in 1914 to protest German militarism and the First World War. His essay Critique of Violence examines acts of violence undertaken by individuals who confront radical evil. Any act that defies radical evil breaks the law in the name of justice. It affirms the sovereignty and dignity of the individual. It condemns the coercive violence of the state. It entails a willingness to die. Benjamin called these extreme acts of resistance divine violence. And that is absolutely false. Killing yourself does not entail justice or the dignity of the individual. It removes you from existence. At least perhaps temporarily until you potentially reincarnate, if that's what you believe in, or you apparently are just removed forever if you go to heaven or hell, as according to the monotheistic religions like Christianity and Islam. The sovereignty and dignity of the individual is not affirmed in suicide. And this idea of acts of violence confronting radical evil, again, these are ideas that are so super idealistic. This is the entire core of this guy's idea. Radical evil. Evil at its root. What you believe is defined as evil. And that is something that is an idealistic act that is enforced on people to have this idea of radical evil. Like, look at this. So, like, in 1914, I'm not going to go and break any new grounds here, but the news flashes that World War I was a complete cluster, right? The reality is that the factions that were engaged with one another in World War I, they were basically empires, right? So you have the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So it's like, they're basically imperial powers that are going and fighting, generally speaking, for various imperial projects. And so the point is that just being a complete idealist, well, we in the West, of course, we align with the Allies in World War I, right? We think that they have the best cause. Would we think that if we were on the German side, or the Austrians, or the Turks, like, would we still think that about World War I? Remember, a lot of people ended up having hostility towards those wars because they lost, right? And we can go and look at the territory that was, taken in by the Germans. Like, we can go and look what they did to Belgium in World War I. We can go and look at how Austro-Hungarian Empire was treating the peoples of Southern Europe. That's all things that we can go and look into. But the problem is that to go and say that that is radical evil, to say that any of those factions represent a radical evil, is very, very incorrect. Like, the reason we associate the Nazis in World War II with radical evil is because they did very genocidal acts. They did very inhuman acts. Acts that, if anyone else would see them, they're defined as radical evil. That is what we look at them as. But to then go and abstract that to go and say, oh, World War I is that exact same way, when it's, again, more of a imperial conflict, that is very much a weird way to go and take it. And so once more, this isn't to go and cherry pick and say, oh, the Germans World War I were awesome. No, of course they weren't. But my point is that to go and classify them as radical evil is also way off the mark. Way off the mark. So, and he's going to go quote Walter Benjamin, "Only for the sake of the hopeless ones have we been given hope." Does that make sense to any of you? That statement there, "Only for the sake of the hopeless ones have we been given hope." Again, just this silly idealistic language, just very silly stuff. All right, then we'll continue with Chris. Bushnell's self-immolation, when most social media posts and news organizations have heavily censored, is the point. It is meant to be seen. Bushnell extinguished his life in the same way thousands of Palestinians, including children, have been extinguished. We could watch him burn to death. This is what it looks like. This is what happens to Palestinians because of us. No, this is what happens to Palestinians because of Hamas. Like, even just looking at this from another perspective, like, people have to go and look at these underdog factions to say, oh, they have absolutely no willpower whatsoever. So nothing that they do is ever things that they can willfully be weighed for, judged for. Just such stupidity. No, Hamas was the one that decided to go across the border and attack. And they're the ones that have been constantly provoking Israel with attacks and kidnappings and rocket attacks all throughout the past decades. This is the reality of the situation. And so instead of going and spending that vast amount of money that has been given to Palestine, they've now instead gone and used it to develop weapons, to develop this massive underground tunnel system. So instead of the people's prosperity, they went and sought out the selfish actions, the selfish ideals of their party, their political philosophy, their absolutist religious ideas. This is what Hamas represents. This is what Hamas is. All right, and now we continue with Chris. The image of Bushnell's self-immolation, like that of the Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc in Vietnam in 1963, or Mehmed Bouazizi, a young fruit seller in Tunisia in 2010, is a potent political message. It jolts the viewer out of somnolence. It forces the viewer to question assumptions. It begs the viewer to act. It is political theater, or perhaps religious ritual, in its most potent form. Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh said of self-immolation, to express will by burning oneself, therefore, is not to commit an act of destruction, but to perform an act of construction, that is, to suffer and to die for the sake of one's people. Oh my gosh. I've remarked before about how I think these sorts of Buddhists are nihilistic. That isn't to go, if you're a Buddhist listening to this, I'm not slagging you personally off. I'm just saying that, there are these, definitely there's this undercurrent in certain people who regard themselves as Buddhists, but no, it is an act of destruction. And it's not a positive act of destruction. And what I mean by that is that a soldier, when they go and kill an enemy of the country, that is a positive act of destruction. When a police goes and kills a criminal, that is a positive act of construction. And this is the reality, that killing yourself is always a negative act of destruction. Like, for you personally, it could be a positive action, but to say that it is, and what I mean by that is that it is a positive action if it goes and achieves your personal goals of a personal situation. So, things like going and saving yourself from having to go and endure severe, extreme pain. That is one reason why people would go and kill themselves. So, I've heard, for example, I remember reading about this one guy who was going to be subjected to hanging and then to this other horrific torture called the drawing and quartering. But anyways, the point is that rather than going through the drawing and quartering business, he went and leapt off the platform and then snapped his neck via the rope, right? So that's an act of suicide, technically, but I think it's one that we would all understand that person committing to go and save themselves from, sustaining their life for like another hour, then having to go through horrific pain. These are things that we understand. However, this is an unnecessary death. By absolutely no means was this needed. Remember, there are paths if you're in the military to go and get out. There is conscientious objection. If you're not interested in being there, the reality is you're not going to be good for your team to be there. And so in a volunteer military, there are ways out. They're not ways that you're going to go and be praised for. They're not ways that you're going to go and get out of there with your college credits intact, but you know what? There are ways out. So what Aaron did was not personally necessary, no matter how you go and look at it. It was a negative act. And then, as far as this jolting the viewer out, well, you know what? Remember, Israel showed people, journalists, politicians throughout the world, those videos where they showed what Hamas was doing to people. They showed them how Hamas was torturing people to death, raping people. This is what they showed them. Those jolted people out of their isolation. So, yeah, showing people extreme actions. Like, I could go and show you cartels going and butchering people, and then that would give you very much a different perspective on whether you thought drugs should be illegal, because that's where they're coming from, these sorts of people who do these horrific sorts of actions. I could do that, and that is a valid point, but you know what, the thing is that the media in the modern day is very sanitized, and that is one of its big problems in a lot of ways, where you don't get, they tell you about horrific things in very vague language oftentimes. They didn't go and show you what that's like, which is even on Twitter, you still have stuff that is censored, even if Twitter is less censored. And then, of course, to get like the absolute hardcore stuff, like stuff where you're actually seeing, for example, what a decomposing body on the battlefield looks like after 3 weeks, a month, you, of course, have very few options about that. But those are images that, in a lot of ways, people should see, because these are horrific acts. And then to understand what horrors, what true horrors of the battlefield looks like, oftentimes you have to go and confront these. But we again live in a very sanitized time, so I guess perhaps I'll agree with Chris on that, perhaps less sanitized media would be a good thing. But I warn you that that's not going to go the way that Hamas fans would want. All right. My gosh. Alright, so these individual self-sacrifices often become rallying points for mass opposition. They can ignite, as they did in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria, revolutionary upheavals. Bouazi, who was incensed that local authorities had confiscated his scales and produce, did not intend to start a revolution. But the pay and humiliating injustices he endured under the corrupt Ben Ali regime resonated with an abused public. If he could die, they could take to the streets. These acts are sacrificial births. They presage something new. They are the complete rejection and its most dramatic form of conventions and reigning systems of power. They are designed to be horrific. They are meant to shock. Burning to death is one of the most dreaded ways to die. Okay, so sacrificial birth. Once more, that is a very extreme way of putting these sorts of things. So the concept that you're going to go and kill yourself and then go and start up a new world. Like, here's the thing. So what I'll tell you is that in old thought, in really old philosophy of people, this is not how it worked. You went and killed others to go and create something that is new. You did not go and kill yourself to go and create something that is new. This is an idea that came out of Christianity. The closest analogy that we can have to this in religion is, for example, if you go back to, well, always you go back to some of these ancient tales of gods who descend into the underworld, and they're not having that done voluntarily. They're having it done by being dragged there and then being killed. And in the Middle East, for example, they have the Epic of Baal, which is an interesting story because Baal in that story goes and tricks Death so that he goes and gives Death a false version of himself, and then goes and survives, and then just goes and hides away for a while, and then Death is absolutely astonished because Baal has, of course, outwitted Death, and that is considered to be how that works. Alright, so let's continue. Self-immolation comes from the Latin stem immolare, to sprinkle with salted flour when offering up a consecrated victim for sacrifice. Self-immolations, like Bushnell's, like the sacred and the profane through the medium of sacrificial death. Do you see what I mean? That this is madness? Again, this is bringing back so much bad stuff from the past. These concepts are bringing up so much bad stuff from the past. And what's more, this is a left-wing Christian guy, Chris Hedges. This is his general idea, his general ideology. And look, even what someone who is like that is linking this to. Ugh, it's absolutely gross. The sacred and the profane, these don't exist. These distinctions do not exist. The ancient peoples did not hold that these distinctions exist. It's only people who believe in this abstract, super idealistic world, and then the material world of ours, where the material is something that is ignorant, and the true world, the true ideas are all in this idealistic world. And then the idea is that you link those two, and the mechanism that he's proposing to link those two through is sacrificial death. Again, this is madness. This is absolute and utter madness that he would even use this sort of language. Absolute extremism. All right, let's continue. But to go to this extreme requires what the theologian Richard Reinhold Niebuhr calls a sublime madness in the soul. He notes that nothing but such madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. This madness is dangerous, but it is necessary when confronting radical evil, because without it, truth is obscured. Liberalism, Niebuhr warns, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten track. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an efficient force in history. So once more, this is an argument for religious fanaticism. This theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, is arguing for religious fanaticism to go and move history. So instead of perceiving history and accepting it as a continuity, well, no, we're now going to look at history through this revolutionary lens, this rotten revolutionary lens that has done so much evil throughout history. So much evil. And then, once more, radical evil. Again, this concept of, so you have the ideal, which is the super good, right? And then the thing that is entirely apart from that ideal, the absolute abyss, the opposite direction of super materialism, super matter. This is considered to be evil, absolute evil, because it lacks any spark of the idealistic world. And that is what they're defining as radical evil. And against that, they're placing truth, which is the idealistic super world. All right, and then Chris Hedges continues. This extreme protest, this sublime madness, has been a potent weapon in the hands of the oppressed throughout history. The some 160 self-immolations in Tibet since 2009 to protest Chinese occupation are perceived as religious rites, act that declare the independence of the victims from the control of the state. Self-immolation calls us to a different way of being. These sacrificial victims become martyrs. So once more, just all of this rotten religious concepts are just coming so to the forefront here. So to the forefront. And these are things that we were supposed to have gone rid of. And you know what? A lot of ancient peoples didn't even have these sorts of concepts. Like, you go to the Navajo, for example, the Navajo in the southwest of the United States, they offered up tobacco wrapped in special colored and special painted shells. Like, that's what they did. They offered up cigarettes to their gods. Like, they did go and do blood sacrifices. Like, I mean, like, just think about how much better that is than almost everything else that you hear. Like, isn't joy God for a smoke break, like, way better than going and, slicing open a animal? Like, it's just ridiculous how this absolute madness is being expressed to us in this article, but it is so perfectly the summation of everything I've been talking about. Just wow. And by the way, I should mention that I'm looking through this for the first time, so this is the actual reaction that you're getting right now. Like, just my actual reaction to reading this thing. Communities of will continue. Communities of resistance, even if they are secular, are bound together by the sacrifices of martyrs. Only apostates betray their memory. The martyr, through his or her example of self-sacrifice, weakens and severs the bonds and coercive power of the state. The martyr rejects a total rejection of the status quo. That is why all states seek to discredit the martyr or turn the martyr into a non-person. They know and fear the power of the martyr, even in death. And thus, the martyr is evil. The concept of the martyr is evil, and I'm going to tell you why. The martyr seeks to go and overthrow. It isn't just the status quo. It isn't just saying, oh, there's this bad person in power. No, no, no. What martyrs seek to do fundamentally is go and alchemically transform the population of a place into something different, into something that goes and represents what they want for the world, their ideals. That is fundamentally what the martyr is trying to go and accomplish, which is why they're called witnesses. The word martyrdom in Greek is the word for witness. And so what happens is that you might hear that and go, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that fundamentally what they're trying to do in this whole revolutionary idea of history is that you're trying to go to a place and then say, oh, we need to go and set ourselves apart from the past to go and break with the past. In this most extreme form, this has come to be the utter rejection of the past, where you go and look at the past and say, oh, we hate everything that happened there. We hate everyone who has led up to us. And this is insanity from the perspective of life. Life has gone and led up to this present day over billions of years. It's like a spreading out tree. And to go and say, I hate the past, is to go and say, I hate the tree that I sprouted from. That is what we're talking about. And remember that when you're talking about this insanity of the sort of language that religions use, in the Bible, they have this example from Jesus, for example, where he talks about people being grafted onto trees like branches. So people from other places are being taken and incorporated into this new tree that they're building. This is a very rotten idea. It's an idea that is super intertwined with idealism, and it's been an idea that's led to massive amounts of evil throughout history. This is what every single revolutionary idea throughout history, the establishment of the oligarchies, the transformation of the democratic societies of the far past into the oligarchic controlled civilizations, the absorption of the peoples in those sorts of states into the monotheistic traditions, where they're going and forcing people to go and believe in certain ways, to go and believe in one exact ideal. This is the evil that the martyrs represent. This is what self-sacrifice is, this obsession with self-sacrifice is. You aren't supposed to go and kill yourself. You're supposed to go and ensure that there is a continuity, that you continue to live. And so this is why this whole ideal of the martyr is evil. And this is why the people who revel in it are, as a matter of fact, the evil. Because we must now go and say that we as non-absolutists, as people who reject absolutism, who believe in historical continuity, absolutism for us must become evil. That is how we must view it as. And that's why we must go as hard as we can against it. Because if we don't, remember, absolutism breeds fanatics. We as non-absolutists do not breed fanatics. We have to breed people that are rational and strong. That is who we are. But we are going to be up against people who are fanatical, who are violent, who have all of these evil impulses, and who believe that if they die, if they're hurt, if they're going and being rejected by society, they go and revel in that. This is what the example of the martyr teaches. Absolute breaks with the historical continuity that lead to violent, evil societies being established. All right, then he's going to go and give a couple of other examples. So we have those example of the Quaker. He gives an example of a radical Catholic priest. Then he talks about the John Pollock incident in Prague. All right, and he finally comes to this. One day, if the corporate state and apartheid state of Israel are dismantled, the street where Bushnell lit himself on fire will bear his name. He will, like Pollock, be honored for his moral courage. Palestinians, betrayed by most of the world, already look to him as a hero. Because of him, it will be impossible to demonize all of us. Divine violence terrifies a corrupt and discredited ruling class. It exposes their depravity. It illustrates that not everyone is paralyzed by fear. It is a siren call to battle radical evil. This is what Bushnell intended. His sacrifice speaks to our better selves. There, that's idealism. In a nutshell, absolute idealism. In a nutshell. Our better selves, think about what that means. No, you are yourself right now. You're good, you're bad. There's parts that you love, the parts that you dislike about yourself, that is you. That is still you. Is the potential that you have, the potential that you can go and put into the world. The development that you can have. That is you. There is no this better self and this worse self of yourself. No. It is just yourself. And this is a call to violence. This is recognized as a call to violence, which is what Bushnell intended. Yes, that is absolutely true. And a corrupted, discredited ruling class, once more, that is Hamas. Remember, he's trying to go and tell you that Israel has a corrupt and discredited ruling class when, well, Israelis have a functioning democratic system. And again, go look at those poll numbers. They're going to go and vote Netanyahu out next time. He's not going to be the leader of Israel anymore. Him and his party have been falling down in popularity very intensively because they're viewed as not having a very good response about not having prepared that border to go and prevent this sort of issue from happening. And paralyzed by fear, again, this is another call to fanaticism. So suicide is now regarded as an act of moral courage. What is courage here? To go and kill yourself? Again, this is what we're looking at. They want people to go and be sacrificial victims because they don't care about reality at the heart, at the core. They don't care about the real, true world. They care about this idealistic fantasy world that they have in their minds that exists somewhere out there where all of their ideals come to be, where they exist, where they go and manifest themselves. This is why people like this, if you ever go and look at their the fiction stories that they tell, this is the only place that they can go and manifest the realities that they like, because the realities that they claim to love, these idealistic worlds, they don't exist in reality. They can't exist in reality. In reality, we cannot betray our friends. That is an evil action. To go and just if we were to go and randomly attack Israel, what would that say? We've been their friends for so long. They've developed with us. They have never done anything to harm us. And yet we're supposed to go and attack them for people who hate us, who have contributed. Let's not forget, these Hamas people, they have contributed to the sort of violent acts that have been going around the Western world. These actions where Islamic terrorists have gone and slaughtered hundreds of people. This is what Hamas and their ideology has contributed to, direct attacks upon us. We're not going to go and betray our friends for people who are fundamentally our enemies, who to us are fundamentally evil, because that is what they have to be. This is reality. This is how reality works. It's much the same way as looking, for example, at a tiger who is coming to eat you and going, well, perhaps, the tiger is hungry. Why not let him eat me? That would be a moral action, would it not? This is, by the way, an allusion to an old Buddhist story where I'm also going to go and, again, point out that sort of nihilistic tendency there. So why not go and let that tiger come and eat me? Would that be a just and nice thing to do for the tiger? Well, no, no. You live. You live on. That's what beings who live are intended to do. To live on, to go and carry on, and they go and overcome other beings when they are challenged. That is reality. So we're not going to go and betray the people who like us, who contribute to our society. And consider just that aspect. Israelis do a lot of stuff. Like the Israelis, the Jewish global population is a very educated population, and they do contribute a lot of technological stuff. And compared to that, there is nothing for us in that Gaza Strip. Like Hamas does not go and conducively build the same sort of society that can go and actively contribute to the world. Instead, what they contribute is this fanatical impulse, this impulse to go and say, oh, you in Western societies should go and hate your societies for our sake. So, idealism, just once more, is an evil, evil, evil idea. A very, very evil idea. First comment is someone talking about, oh, people who are trying to manufacture dirt on Aaron. So it's more, they want this pure-hearted, mythologized figure. They don't want to know about, how Aaron whacked off to a fictional cartoon lesbian ship for 4 years. They don't want to hear about that sort of thing. They want to hear about how he glorified and reveled in the deaths of 3 American soldiers. They don't want to hear about that sort of thing. They want this fictional idea, this fictional Aaron who they can go and mythologize and claim is this wonderful, great person who is this sacrificial martyr, this sacrificial king. That is what they want. We're not going to let them have that. We're not going to have this sacrificial king ideology. Yep. Oh, and immediately followed after that by someone talking about sacrificing their lives for the greater good. Idealism and its wonders shine down upon us. You're seeing by now, by the way, why idealism is such an awful, horrible, horrible idea. Horrible ideology. And then, let's see, so here's just some other fun articles. So right beneath us, we have suggested for me The Death of Israel, also by Chris Hedges, and Israel's Culture of Deceit by Chris Hedges. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.